Respect for you, respect for me is the best choice I see. How to show respect to all, whether great or whether small.
Okay, so now we are at the end of the road. Oh my word. But you can hold back your tears though. We'll be back in January. But today, okay, is our very last session of the season, and we're going to be talking today about self-control and how it applies to the environment, okay? So we learned a lot of things, okay? What did we learn? What self-control was, right? What self-control was. We learned how to control our emotions, how to control our anger, how to interact with self-control. We learned how a lack of self-control affects society, right? Now we need to turn our minds to the green movement, right? Does the green movement have significance? Yes, it does, okay? And this is the foundational class. This is going to help you in that going green, right? Okay. So, like every class, we do a review, right? We're just going to talk about the things we talked about last week. Keep you on your P's and Q's, right? Okay? So what's one of the things that we learned last week? So last week we named some ways society has been affected by a lack of self-control. What's one of those ways? We talked about school shootings, right? A lack of respect for each other. We talked about we answered the question, how can practicing self-control help society? Well, with that ability to practice self-control, we will stop, right? And think before we make a choice and how it affects other people, not just us. Remember we talked about last week? That attitude, I'm responsible for me and only me, right? And we found that that was a huge myth, okay? And we can see that when we look at crime in society. We see that when we look at violence in society. When people make that immoral choice, right, what occurs? You bring not just yourself in the ring, someone else, and potentially a whole mess of people into the ring, okay? Right? So keep that in mind. Keep you on your P's and Q's. Okay? So now, we're going to get into self-control and the environment. Okay? So think about it. Like I just said, so far, you have been given the tools how to improve your personal life and the lives of others with self-control. Like I said, we learned what self-control was. We learned how to apply it to our emotions. Okay? How to control our anger. How to apply self-control to our interactions, right? Our interactions and communications, right? Being a active listener, right? Being a person who responds well in a peaceful manner, even to someone who is losing self-control, okay? We talked about those things, and once again, how crime, how our actions affect others, the ripple effect. Think about that pebble, okay? Keep that picture in your mind, all right? So, with that being said, all that knowledge, let's take it and let's expand it, okay? Today, you're going to be given that tool, and we're going to expand self-control to fit into our society and especially our environment, okay? Now that we're thinking of self-control and going green, right? We have to stop and think, okay, of some of the forms of pollution and why they exist. They exist because our misuse and abuse, okay? So just what is pollution? What is pollution? I'm sure everyone out there can answer this question. What is pollution, okay? Pollution is the contamination of the environment with waste material, okay? Any type of waste material, okay? So there's two types to keep in mind, okay, of waste material. We have your natural pollutants. Natural pollutants are things like volcanic ash, you know, the pyroclastic flows and the ash that comes from a volcano, right? But that's something that the earth can repair itself. Our earth is a wonderful thing, right? it can actually repair itself when we talk about natural pollutants, okay? But then we have our man-made pollutants, okay? And man-made pollutants either decompose slowly or don't decompose at all. And the difference between natural pollutants and man-made pollutants is that man-made, not so nice to get rid of. Not so nice to get rid of. And not, the earth may not necessarily have the ability to repair itself from that pollutant, okay? So what am I talking about? Things like plastics, right? PCBs, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, okay? Pharmaceuticals, things like that get put into this earth that can't necessarily be taken out through the earth's natural processes, okay? So I want you to think, okay? All those out there, I want you to think, okay? And maybe even jot it down, okay? What are some ways you think our environment is being polluted? Think about it for a hot millisecond, okay? What are some ways you think our environment is being polluted? So let's think about something. What's the most recent that we can all think of, right? BP oil spill, right? And they're still coming out with articles about that, of how it's affected the food supply, right? They're finding fish with oil inside of them, right? Who eats fish? Who eats fish? I do. You do. the sea creatures in there. See, you see how it's very important that we recognize ourselves as the caretakers of this environment, and we recognize and we make responsible choices, okay? So keep that in mind. Oil spills, right? Getting rid of waste, materials that can't decompose into the rivers and lakes. Excessive use of fuel burning, creating carbon monoxide in the atmosphere through fuel burning. All these ways we contaminate our own environment. My, oh my, how things have changed. So now with that being said, when we learned about what pollutants are, let's take it back a few decades, okay? Before all these technological advances, right? And when we put ourselves in today and we think about all the technology that we are so blessed to have, right? It makes it easy to assume that there will always be an abundance of supplies and resources. We always tend to think that just because we have all these advances, right? You know, we've advanced so far, we don't even stop to think, right, about how our actions, how these things affect the world around us, okay? And some of the things that we take for granted, right? We don't even stop and think. And that's the point of self-control. What? We stop and we think, okay? Technological advances are not without their consequences, okay? But it's up to us to make choices that will allow us to advance, but also protect, okay? So like I said before, take it back a couple decades, okay? We had people who, I know I hear a lot of stories from a man in Oklahoma who bathing in cold water in a little tiny bucket, right? A little tiny basin, using outhouses. I mean, what did he say? He said his form of running water was, go get that water and bring it back to me. Run and give it back to me. That was running water back then in his day. And that must have been back in the 1930s, right? 1930s, 1940s. So not too long ago. I mean, we may think that was a long time ago. That's not too long ago, right? But with the advances we have cars, we have the Industrial Revolution that occurred, right? All these things, and we never stop to think sometimes how is this going to affect the air I breathe? How is this going to affect the soil that I get my food on? And I don't want to get a little too ahead of myself because we're going to talk about that. And some of you watching this, may be shocked to find out some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. I know a lot of you have heard of the saying, what goes around comes around, okay? And what does that mean? That simply means what you put into something is what you're going to get out, no matter what it is, okay? Same thing applies to our own actions, right? To our own character, what we apply ourselves to, right? You can't sit there with some, you can't sit there with homework, right? And you say, well, I'm just going to kind of half it and expect to get like an A++, right? What you put into it is most likely what you're going to get out of it. If you put a D effort into a paper, you're going to get a D back. Okay, the same thing applies to our environment. So that's why it's so important that we put effort and thought into how we care for our environment, and it will determine whether we reap positive or negative results. So let's take a closer look, okay? And we're going to get into this a little bit more later. You're going to really see something that I know for me shocked me, right? Think about this. There's about 70% of water. Our earth is covered with about 70% of water. Did you know that only 1%, less than 1% of that water is safe to drink? Did you know that? You shake your head, right? Pollutants and disease have been found in some of our food supply, and we're going to get into that later. Millions of tons of garbage and toxic waste products are dumped into the ocean. As we speak, I mean, we've seen the same thing with BP oil spill, even though that was a mistake. There's been some speculation that that was a mistake that could have been avoided with more responsible actions, right? You see how it plays into our environment, right? A character that's positive, responsible. We wouldn't have half of these problems with that positive character, okay? With those positive character traits. And furthermore, we've all heard about smog, right? Smog. I know that LA, I think LA has the worst, maybe. No, I think China actually has the worst. Smog. Some places endure sicknesses due to heavy smog. Think of this, back into, I believe it was the 1940s. About 19 people died from smog inhalation. 19 people. Oh, well, yeah, that's a small number. No, the fact that anybody can die from just breathing air, it concerns me. I don't care if it was just 19 people, okay? That concerns me, and it should concern you too. So let's take a closer look at our air, okay? So, Mrs. Wallace, we have all these problems. I mean, there's so much stuff in our air, smog, you know what I'm saying? I think I'm just going to hold my breath, right? Well, it doesn't matter how long you can hold your breath. Eventually, sooner or later, you're going to have to breathe, okay? I don't care where you are. I don't care where you think you're going, okay? You're going to have to breathe like the rest of us, okay? So, think about some other forms of pollution, okay? The automobile industry, with the advances in the automobile industry, we have increased toxins and pollutants going into the air from our car exhaust. Automobile exhaust, and then we have our industrial factories. I think it's a sad day, okay? And like I said, take it back to what I said earlier, okay? That we need to be responsible. We need to be as a society that can advance in these technological advances, but at the same time protect, okay? And we'll see that's a lack of, that sometimes it stems from these misuses and abuses come from a lack of self-control, a lack of respect, a lack of stopping and thinking of the consequences of our actions in terms of these advances, okay? So think about industrial factories. I think if I go to Detroit right now, okay, I used to live in an area of Detroit where I could go, I remember going on the highway, there's this huge industrial smoke billowing from the top of these buildings, right? And I remember, you could tell you're coming into that area. As soon as you come into that area, you can smell it. It smelled like rotten eggs. That's what I used to say. That it smelled like rotten eggs, right? Do we think this is normal? Do we think that this is not going to affect our air in some type of way, right? And I was told that the rotten egg smell was coming from sulfur, either sulfuric acid or sulfur, right? Okay? So think about that. Some of these chemicals that are billowing from those factories react with the atmosphere and they produce the smog. That's what actually produces the smog, is the smoke, that smoke billowing from these factories. And then we think of acid rain, right? And that produces the acid rain. Now, acid rain, and I know that we've probably learned about this in elementary school, acid rain actually can chip the paint off of a building. Okay? So if acid rain can chip the paint off of your building, right, what is it doing when it goes into the soil? Okay? What is it doing if it gets on your skin? Okay? There's a reason why it's called acid rain and not just water rain. Right? And furthermore, thirsty anyone? Okay, like I said before, our earth is covered with 70% of water, but only a small percentage of that is suitable for humans to use. Okay? 1.2 billion people live without access to safe water. Okay? 1.2 billion. Okay? I didn't say 1.2. I said 1.2 billion people live without access to safe water. Okay, that's the type of stuff we're looking at today. Next. And furthermore, 2.5 billion people are without sanitation. So like how we have our sanitation plants for the water we use. Why do you think those sanitation plants are there? Okay? I recently watched a documentary, right? That those sanitation plants, the things that we consume, right? We consume so much, and the water is so polluted, we need these sanitation plants, right? We need these billions of dollars going into these sanitation plants, okay? Because of why? Well, partly because of a lack of self-control, right? We dump drugs into the water, right? We dump chemicals into the water. All these things, right? Syringes, right? Syringes, we put a lot of things into the water, right? So we need these billion-dollar sanitations, right? And we thought, according to this documentary, we thought that we had solved all our problems, right? We solved all the problems. We had these sanitation plants that get rid of all the stuff and then, feed the water back to our houses, right? Well, here's where the lack of self-control, right? These sanitation plants, right, once they're done, what do they do with all the garbage that they've separated from the water? What do they do with it? Did you know that what they do with it is either A, dump it back into the water, or B, dump it back onto the soil, right? And what soil am I talking about? Agricultural soil. So what does that mean? Dumping it right back onto your food. Okay? You see where the lack of self-control, because if we had stopped and thought, right? I like what the Peaceful Solution says. The Peaceful Solution said it's better to prevent than to intervene. Okay? Because this system, when we have people dumping things into the water, we're not being, and even ourselves, right? Has anyone ever moved into an area where, I know for myself, we had to sign a contract that we wouldn't dump anything down the drain, anything crazy down the drain. Why? Because there's a creek nearby, right? Why? Because wildlife live at that creek. They drink out of that water. Why? Because that creek, right, could potentially run off into a lake, right? Because that lake could potentially run off into a river. Because that river could run off into the ocean. We're all connected here. This earth is all connected here. You see why? It's important to stop and think, okay? Why do you think they have those signs at parks that say no dumping? Because most likely that water is going to run off into, eventually, for all those ecologists, eventually it's going to get to the ocean, right? And eventually it's going to affect our food supply, the food chains in the ocean, okay? I want to bring it all home for you. I found a very intriguing snippet off of YouTube. And it was I did not even know this thing existed, but I'm going to have you watch and then we're going to talk about it. Okay?
Northeast of Hawaii, the ocean currents form a giant whirlpool carrying human debris from around the Pacific. Its scientific name is the North Pacific Gyre, but today it's better known as the Great Garbage Patch, an area the size of Queensland with 100 million tonnes of plastic spread out across the ocean. Drag a net anywhere in this part of the ocean and in a little while you'll collect a toxic soup of discarded plastic, big and small. Seattle-based photographer Chris Jordan recently journeyed to Midway Atoll in the middle of the Great Garbage Patch to document this man-made phenomenon. What he found is pretty mind-blowing.
I had been studying for quite a while the phenomenon of the Pacific Garbage Patch. I was looking for a way to visualize it. It was really surreal to land on Midway and to see my worst hopes about what I would find there were true. These are all albatross chicks hatched out of the egg, and the very first meal they ever got was deadly to them. What happens is, when the birds hatch, one of the parent goes out and flies looking for food, and they search over this vast area of the Pacific. And what they come back with is a belly full of plastic bottle caps and toothbrushes and cigarette lighters and combs and magic markers and syringes and all of our plastic junk. And they feed that to their babies. And then over a period of weeks and months, the baby's body cavity fills up with plastic to the point where it literally can't eat another thing. Even though their stomach is full, they're not receiving any nutrition, and so they die of starvation and dehydration and choking. I guess like any really extremely profound experience, you can learn about it and read about it in advance, and you think you're prepared, and then when you're actually in it, it's still shocking. To encourage recycling takes our eye off of what the real solution is to radically reduce our consumption. But it's funny when you start talking to people about that, especially people who work at big companies, they're just not interested. Simply allow yourself to feel whatever it is that you feel about this without jumping to the way to solve it, because I think we really need to feel these things. And if we can feel them deeply, even if the feelings aren't comfortable, then those are the feelings that will turn into the fuel that can drive passionate action.
There's a few things, I want to talk about that for a second. There's a few things that he said that I thought really kind of brings the message home, okay? Number one thing he said, right, is that when you bring this idea, maybe if you bring these pictures, right, to a large industrial industry who a lot of them, well, I won't say like all of them, but a lot of them have been known to use the waste from their own industries to dump into the ocean, okay? And what I want to bring home was he's saying that if you bring these pictures, a lot of them aren't interested, okay? Yeah, whatever. You know what I mean? We were talking about how it's a lack of self-control. Remember what self-control is? You stop and consider the consequences of a specific action, right? Well, think of what is lacking? What is lacking when you bring these pictures to an industry that's polluting our waters, right? What is lacking? Compassion, empathy, right? Remember we talked about a couple weeks ago when we talked about some of those positive character traits, being compassionate, putting ourselves in the other man's shoes, right? And we were just talking about how everything is connected. I'm pretty sure, and to take it to my next point, that is from the Pacific Garbage Patch. That's what they call it. The scientific name for it is the Pacific Gyre. but it's this large amount of ocean smack dab between North America and Europe there, in that area, where it's nothing but plastic and garbage floating. That's it, right? You can seriously take a boat, go out there, put a little net in there, and you pick up what? Someone picked up a toilet bowl, right? This is what is in our ocean right now as we speak, okay? I'm pretty sure the person who threw away that plastic bottle or that toilet bowl, right, wasn't thinking, wasn't stopping and considering, where is this going to end up? Where did it end up? In the albatross chicks, right? I want to kind of bring something home, okay? Everything on this planet has an awesome purpose, okay? I think that's sometimes what helps to practice that self-control and stop and think about our actions first, when we realize that everything has a purpose, okay? The albatross, I learned a lot of stuff about how animals, right, without these animals, specific type of animals that clean up for us, the microorganisms that clean up the dead matter, slow down, like, you know, rodent infestations, all this thing, they have a purpose. So within that self-control, we need to be stopping and considering, okay, if I throw this plastic bag out the window, where's it going? Okay? Where's it going to end up? Okay? Stopping and thinking and considering. Okay? Even something as small as the trash is right there. Okay, I really don't feel like walking over there right now with this bottle right now, so I'm just going to chuck it. Where is it ending up? That's where self-control comes in. Where is it ending up? Is it going to end up in this area? What do we have? I seen a couple of cardinals the other day, I think they're called. Cardinals, I mean, we live in a wooded area. We see a lot of different, deer, a couple times we saw a deer, we see cardinals and things like that. Who's eating it, right? Is it this animal here that helps clean up our planet, right? You know how, like, certain fish, right? Certain fish. You know how when you get a fish tank, right? To kind of put it in perspective some more. You know how you get a fish tank and maybe you don't feel like cleaning out the fish tank like every single day, so what do? You buy the bottom feeders, right? Or the glass suckers. I don't know. I don't know what they're called. Right? Because they clean, right? Imagine for a second we didn't have any of those animals, right? We're all connected, okay? Even when we talked about the BP oil spill, they're still finding oil in fish, okay? Who eats that fish, right? Not just the sea life, not just the sea life. That's going into our food supply. And when we have people with a lack of self-control, they're going to sell that to you anyway. You see what I'm saying? The ability to stop and consider, okay? Where is this action going to lead to? All right? Just the facts on water pollution, okay? 1.5 billion people lack safe drinking water. We talked about that a little bit earlier. 1.5 billion, okay? 5 million deaths. Yes?
Is that in the world or just here?
In the world. In the world. Excuse me. 5 million deaths per year are because of waterborne diseases. Waterborne diseases, okay? Next. In the year 2000, now this is the year 2000, so imagine if we haven't curbed our behavior by now, okay, imagine what it is in the year 2010, okay? In the year 2000, 11,270 beaches were closed due to raw sewage and toxins. Now, what I noticed about that fact is that I never see that on the news, do you? A lot of this stuff goes unreported, right? So, I can see how people don't really, that's where we come in. That's why when the media is not showing this to us, we need to come in and be like, okay, what's going to occur if I do such and such? If I dump this, if I throw this out, right? That's where we need to come in, because I think a lot of times we tend to think out of sight, out of mind, really, and that's not the case. It's out of sight, but it doesn't mean it's not going on and that it's not affecting us. Okay? Excuse me. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, but I wanted to touch on this too. People who ingest polluted water containing PCBs can develop cancer and produce children with birth defects. PCBs, heavy metals, okay? Heavy metals that are dumped into, because I know that the seas and oceans don't naturally have heavy metals like that, okay? Lack of self-control, all right? Dumping these things, what do they tell you? What's one of those famous facts about fish, you know? What's one of those famous facts about fish? It helps with the brain, right? It helps with the brain, right? The omega-3s, right? All these things. You see how, when we talked about how they have purpose, especially for us too, right? Well, what's another famous fact they tell you about fish? It's a warning, right? They tell you mercury, all right? PCBs, heavy metals. It's gotten to the point where I mean, I like fish and everything like that, but if you're telling me don't eat more than, I think it's 4 ounces, that's about like that much. That's a half a cup. Don't eat more than 4 ounces, because mercury is what? A neurotoxin. Mercury is a neurotoxin, right? If you're consuming too much of that. But how did it get there in the first place, right? I know fish don't naturally have mercury, unless I'm missing something, right? Okay? So this is what I want you to get to see today, our lack of self-control. We don't stop when we're not thinking, and I keep reiterating that because it seems like sometimes we kind of, like how we talked about earlier, controlling our thoughts, right? Sometimes we say, well, I just did it without thinking, right? And the truth is we're always thinking, okay? Just like how I talked about a couple weeks ago. All right. Okay, so half the drinking water in the U.S. comes from groundwater, okay? 25 to 70%, 75% of that groundwater is contaminated from leaking underground storage tanks, okay? So that's a large amount of water that is contaminated, right? Because I always wonder, we have all these sanitation, we're literally putting billions of dollars into these sanitation plants, okay? I was always wondering why we have the sanitation plants, but when the water gets to my tap, I still have to purify it with my little machine, right? I still have to spend like about $100 to purify it, right? We talked about it earlier. All the time, prevention is better than intervention, because we see that intervention is not all that it's cracked up to be in terms of our environment, okay? These problems are really hard to fix now because of a person who I don't know where to put my garbage, so I'm just going to dump it over here, you know what I mean, without stopping and thinking. Okay, and this one's the most shocking to me. 1 cup of gasoline can pollute 350,000 gallons of water. Yes, it's true. You're looking at me like I'm crazy, but it's true. 1 cup. Think about this. That's a cup. Right there. Can pollute 350,000 gallons of water. Okay? So, earlier we were talking about how we had to sign a contract that we weren't going to dump oil down our drain because there's a creek nearby. So, think about that. Maybe gasoline, but maybe my little cup of oil that I'm just like, well, it couldn't hurt this time, right? So just like I was saying, how it's better to prevent than to intervene, right? The damage has already been done, okay? We are at great risk when our food is contaminated, like we talked about earlier, like with the BP oil spill, right? Oil in the fish, oil in the sea life. That I know that, New Orleans and that area in Louisiana, they thrive off of that market, right? And if like about 100% of the things that you're working with are contaminated, like I said, we have some people who lack of self-control, sell it to you anyway, okay? And then, like I said, like I said, we talked about PCBs are just one of the man-made contaminants in our streams and lakes. One. Okay? Out of a lot. Okay? I'm talking about PCBs, industrial waste, right? Industrial waste, insecticides, pesticides, pharmaceutical drugs, right? Sex hormones, right? Yeah. In the water. Okay? Because we chose not to think before we're dumping whatever we're dumping. Okay? A large medical facility, I seen an article one time where a large medical facility, what do they jump down the drain? Blood. Right? Blood. Okay? Alright. Now this title is kind of, maybe it's a little like, what? Right? Cannibalistic cows. Okay? Food becomes polluted when people within our society do not stop and think. Okay? Once again, what are they thinking about? What are they thinking about? Them Benjamins, right? Right? And a lot of people were thinking about them Benjamins, that attitude where, I'm just going to get this money, that, it's all about this money. Well, this is the reason why we're having polluted food to eat at this time. Okay? And what do I mean by that? Cows are supposed to eat grass, right? Right. That's what they're made for. They got, 4 little stomachs in there. They eat the grass, then they, throw it back up, chew it, go it down. Don't mean to gross you out, but they're supposed to eat grass, right? Well, some people in the cattle industry believe they shouldn't, right? So what do I mean by that? Some people in the cattle industry, because it's all about the Benjamins, baby, right? It's all about the Benjamins. So I want a cheap way. So it's like they all get together, maybe. I'm not saying it's really like this, but they all get together. How am I going to make more profit and spend less money? Go ahead.
I don't know. This always confused me because I don't see how grass isn't cheap. It's already there. I don't understand why they would spend money to have something else for them to eat when the grass is already there. I don't know. I just thought that was weird.
Right. Exactly. I mean, it makes no sense, really. The grass, like you were saying, the grass is there. Just have a field. That's all you need to do. Maybe you need to just buy the field. You got your grass there. Let them loose, right? They'll eat. They're eating, fertilizing, and eating. Hey, to our little, maybe we're not in the business. To our brains, it's like, well, I mean, that seems a lot cheaper than building this huge machine, right? It's called a rendering machine. And what is rendering? Does anybody heard of rendering? Rendering is when you take something and you boil it down, right? So what do I mean? What they do is, for some reason, they believe it's cheaper. Now put your imagination hats on. Not even imagination. Just put this picture into your mind right now. They build these huge machines, right? These big old forklifts, right? If a cow dies, what do? Get that forklift, pick that cow up, throw it in this machine that grinds them up and melts them down into their feed, and they feed it right back to the cow, right? But not just that, though. Not just that. Dead dogs, cats, anything you can find, roadkill. That's what it's called. That's the word I was looking for. Roadkill, right? That's what they find, and they feed this right back to the cows. So what does that have anything to do with me, right? Okay, well, I mean, it's got 4 stomachs. It can, filter it out and, come out the other end, right? Well, on the contrary, this practice has led to mad cow disease. That's why I always say you can tell which farm is doing it when they have an outbreak of mad cow disease. What is mad cow disease? It's like these things called prions. They're called false proteins that punch holes. Pretty much, you can think of it like a big fist. Punch holes into the cow's brain, so it's no longer able to function properly. So that's why they call it mad cow, because some of these cows were found scratching, rubbing themselves against the wall until they rubbed their skin off. That's why it's called mad cow disease, because it seems like the cows go crazy, right? Cows go crazy. But we don't just have mad cow disease, we have CJD, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. What is that? Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is the human form of mad cow disease. So if we think that this practice has no effect on us, when you eat the beef, guess who's eating the prions, the false prions that punch holes in your brain? You are, right? Because of a lack of self-control. Nobody stopped to think this simple concept that seems so simple to us. Just eat grass. Just make them eat grass, right? That's it, right? No, but all about the Benjamins, baby. All about the Benjamins. All about the Benjamins, right? So now we have CJD. And I want to bust a big myth out there right now, right? What's that myth? Well, I've been eating beef, for so-and-so amount of years, so, I'm fine. I'm walking around, you don't see me scratching on walls and scratching my neck like this, or going crazy, right? Put this into perspective. CJD takes 5 years to show up in a cow. CJD takes up at least, right, so that's the minimum number, 15 years to show up in a person, okay? And it's been linked to Alzheimer's, right, Parkinson's, right, because these are all degenerative diseases where your mind starts going, right? So they're actually starting to rethink these diseases we're getting as we're older. Could this been because of maybe such and such amount of beef that I ate 15 years ago, right? It takes that long to show up. A lot of things that we do to our bodies or that are done to our food supply that we take into our bodies take a long time to show up, right? And by the time that we get to that age, we done forgot that we had it and we don't associate it with these things, right? Okay, so that's a huge myth. I've been doing this for so-and-so amount of years and I'm fine. Well, there's no telling if you're going to be fine later on down the line. And that's where we need to start having some changes in character, especially the people who handle our food. Okay? No matter if you eat burgers from Burger King every day, right? Even though it's fast food, where do you get that food? Potatoes, from the fries, the burger, the beef, right? Okay? So keep that in mind. Think about that. Think about that. And also think about whether these cattle ranchers stop to think about these consequences, right? All about the Benjamins. I'm going to keep saying that, right? All about the Benjamins. So I'm not concerned with what's going on with you, right? And we talked about last week how that attitude, this is where it's gotten us. That attitude, I'm responsible for me, right? You wouldn't put someone in power who is acting like that, so why should we act like that ourselves, right? So the saga continues. Yes, I'm sorry, it gets worse, okay? So think about it. The diet of the world's inhabitants is agriculturally based. So like I said, even if you eat fast food every day, right, some of that food has come from agriculture, okay? Farmers, cattle ranchers, etc., 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 okay? So with the increased consumption to meet these demands, right, to meet these demands of a society that consumes a lot, right? Science has sought ways to reduce the loss of crops. So we're talking about insecticides, herbicides. Well, because we need to use increased insecticides and herbicides, what do? We have GMO crops where they actually manipulate the gene of the vegetable or whatever they're doing, right? So what's the most famous one? I think it's Roundup Ready corn, right? So that way they can spray all the insecticides and pesticides they want and the crop won't die, okay? But a lot of controversial information has come up, right? That the effects of manipulating a gene, because a lot of times they take maybe a gene from a certain insect or bug or animal and they put it into corn, right? To get these desired results, right? And a lot of times they use viruses to do it because that's what viruses do. They can infiltrate a gene. Does that make sense? So the effects, the long-term effects, we have no idea. It's up in the air, right? It's up in the air. right? Nobody knows. And like I said, sometimes we think, well, I've been, whatever. I've been doing this for a long time. It takes a long time to show up. So take a bite out of this, okay? As though we would love to see. We would love to see. And I emphasize this through this whole series of classes. We would love to see the people at the top or the people that are responsible for us have this self-control, right? But it starts with us, too. Okay? The only person you can control is you, okay? It starts with us, and remember, we talked about the positive ripple effect. There's a negative ripple effect and then a positive one, right? It starts with you, right? So, here's a few tips. I know I seem like doom and gloom. I've been giving you all these problems with society, and it's like, oh man, what are we going to do? Well, here's a few things that you can actually do to help yourself as well and control yourself. One of the basic ones, don't litter, okay? You don't know where that's ending up, okay? As we see with the Pacific garbage patch, right? I'm pretty sure the person who threw away that plastic bottle didn't know it was going to end up in a bird, right? Okay? And it's a lot worse than that. Those are only a few pictures. When I was looking up the garbage patch, it's actually a lot worse than that. Okay? We're talking beaches that are littered, and we're talking about whales and things like that coming up with these things in their bodies. Okay? So don't litter. Wash your hands thoroughly. And a lot of things, these things, I think, is also a part of self-respect too. Okay? We can no longer take that attitude that I'm going to do whatever and just, it's not affecting me in any type of way. Right? So one of the things is, one of the positive character traits, get educated about your water. Know your water, right? We know that our water has certain chemicals in it, right? So what do we choose to do? I mean, it's a small investment, but water is like the basic thing you need, okay? So if you're drinking contaminated water, what do you think that's going to do to you when you get older, right? You're going to have all these illnesses, and you don't know where it came from because later on down the line, right? Know your water, okay? Know your water and act accordingly, okay? You need 8 glasses of water every day. If I'm drinking 8 glasses of PCBs, not too nice, right? Not too nice. Never pour toxic chemicals like paint thinner or pesticides down the drain. Even oil, olive oil. I'm pretty sure a lot of people know that. I mean, we won't pour olive oil down the drain, but we'll be soon to throw a bag out the window when we're driving, you know what I'm saying, or a cigarette on the ground, So think about these things. Never pour it down the drain because this all leads back. I was talking earlier about a documentary I seen about the municipal systems, the sanitation systems, that once they've cleansed the water, guess what they do with the junk that's left over? They throw it right back in the water and they throw it right back on the soil, right? And this is toxic stuff, okay? Like severely toxic. They call it biosolids, but the original term was sludge.
So they take the water, put it in the sanitation thing, clean it out, and then the stuff that they cleaned out they put back, so they have to clean it again later. Okay.
Yeah. And some of that stuff they actually end up throwing on to agricultural land, right? Because they say it's full of nitrogen. You need nitrogen to grow plants and things like that. But there's been a lot of people in those areas that have died and suffocated to death because of the chemicals that are in it. Because you got to think about it. All this contaminants in the water, right? Viruses, diseases, drugs, all these things, and we're putting it right back where it came from? Pretty sure. Yeah, I know. It doesn't really make too much sense, right? But that's what I'm saying. We've lost the ability to stop and think. It could be something that is so simple. If I just clean the water, why am I throwing it back in? Right? Things like that. Okay, so on an individual level, don't do that. Okay? Don't do that. That's the best advice I can give you. Right? Don't do that. Don't pour anything down your drain. Be mindful. Stop and put effort into caring for this planet. Okay? And then another thing is wash your fruit, veggies, eggs, meats, and then soak them in salt water to help remove any chemicals. And what I was saying is, this is actually a part of self-respect. You're getting educated so you can be a healthier you, okay? Because so that you're not suffering in the long run, okay? And I know we do it, but actually washing your fruit, washing the vegetables, because I know that probably lettuce. I think lettuce is the most dangerous, dangerous food that you can pick up with, just pick up and then just eat it, right?
They said like all leafy vegetables.
All
like that.
leafy vegetables, right? Okay? So that's one of the things that you can do. It's self-respect and respect for the environment around you. Okay? We've come to the end of the road. Oh my word. You can cry now. Okay? As caretakers, we need to consider how the actions affect the environment. We have one planet. I don't care where you think you are. If you think that it's not important, if you think that, oh, this is not really going to hurt it too much, right? We have one planet. We're confined here. Okay, I think sometimes we make actions as if we don't know that, right? We're confined here, all right? Earlier we talked about the air we breathe is contaminated, and we talked about the soil being contaminated. But it's not necessarily from, we talked about two types of pollutants, natural and the man-made, but notice that probably about 80%, 80 to 85% of that is man-made. We did it, right? All those pollutants, okay? So we are the caretakers. We live here, okay? I don't see anybody on a spaceship somewhere else, okay? Pollution is the contamination of the environment with waste material. So we talked a little bit about what pollution was, okay? Everyone in our society, from leaders to policymakers to owners of factories and refineries, must take responsibility for preserving our environment. That's why this character education is so important, right? We got people at the top, right? We talked about, I think it was in the character, how you can have a degree. You can have degree upon degree upon degree, because I'm pretty sure a lot of these people got degrees, right? But think about it. I don't have a degree yet. You don't have a degree yet, right? And we could think of that simple thing. Wait a minute, cows eat grass, right? Why couldn't people who got, degrees upon degrees upon degrees, think about that. Cows eat grass. Bada bing, bada boom. Done, right? Something like that, okay? So it's the character. It's your character. How you care for the environment and the people around you, like how we talked about in earlier classes, okay? That's counting. This is something that we're going to take for the rest of our lives, okay? And to practice self-control, we must stop and consider how our daily choices affect the ability of all life forms to survive and function, okay, including us. We have to stop and consider, okay, how we're all interconnected, right? I had this little thing that I told to my daughter, right, when we were looking at the trees, right, and just to show how we're connected, right? When we're looking at the trees, I said to her, I was like, did you know that the trees are there because, when we go, they go, right? And then they go, and then we go, right? Because what's occurring there? What am I explaining? The process where we breathe out carbon dioxide and they take it in and they turn it into something breathable. You see how we're connected there. So if we're destroying the soil that they need to live, right? And we have no more trees. Just think about that. We have no more trees. Who's breathing? Not me. Not you. Not you. Not me. Right? Nobody. Right? If we keep going the way that we are, it's going to get that far. Okay? Like I said, a lot of this stuff, you actually have to dig to find out what's really going on this planet. And let me tell you, it ain't pretty, okay? And it's affecting our food, the food that we consume, that we're not seeing the effects in our bodies right now, right? It ain't pretty, and you have to dig pretty hard to find it, right? And that's what I was trying to do for this class. Like, I had to dig. You know what I mean? And the last thing, I will not wait until I'm adversely affected by contaminants. just like how I was saying. I will not wait until I'm older and I'm having lung problems, or I'm having such and such problems here and problems here. I'm having problems here. I'm not going to wait. Just like how we gave you those tips. Just have self-respect, okay? Don't just throw your life up in the air like, well, okay, it tastes great though, right? Educate yourself. One of those positive character traits. Educated. Doesn't mean you have a degree. It means that you gather all the facts before making a choice. Because that helps you make a better choice for you and other people and the environment. Okay? So that's the last thing. So I just want to leave with you with a statement.